Are you troubled by strange noises in the middle of the night?
Do you experience feelings of dread in your basement or attic?
Have you or any of your family ever seen a spook, specter, or ghost?
If the answer is yes, then don't wait another minute. Pick up your phone and call the professionals. Go, Ghostbusters!
Hey everybody, welcome. On behalf of the entire American Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Program, welcome to your Ghostbusters training class. This is going to be a little bit different than your typical spook specter training. We're going to be taking a different approach and looking at Ghostbusters in kind of a fun, different way. We may have different definitions of fun when we talk about Ghostbusters and legal issues, but that's another story. So, without further ado, as I try to get this to go forward, there we go. I want to share some unfortunate news. I know many of you in Ghostbusters 2 saw the ad that was put out there that there would be a free Ghostbusters hot beverage thermal mug and free balloon for the kids. Unfortunately, that's not included in this webinar. It's a hot item, understandably. All due respect to Egon and the Ghostbusters, they didn't give us enough to go around. So unfortunately, that giveaway, despite being advertised in Ghostbusters 2, isn't here today. I am Thomas Harper. I'm the IHL Senior Counsel for the Red Cross here at our national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And it's my privilege and pleasure to be able to come to you and talk about one of my absolute favorite movie franchises, Ghostbusters. I help lead our IHL dissemination program, and this is another chapter in my favorite aspect of our program, which is combining pop culture and legal issues and trying to better understand the real world law through the lens of some of our favorite movies and TV shows. Fun fact, I was almost an actual Ghostbuster. So I would have been Egon there. It came really down to the wire. But unfortunately, I wasn't even born when Ghostbusters was made or when it came out. So I was beat to the punch by Harold Ramis. I hold no grudges. I'm perfectly happy with my title and my job here. It would have been nice to be a Ghostbuster. Timing didn't work out on that one. So today we're going to be talking and focusing on the two original movies. No disrespect to the newer Ghostbusters movies like Afterlife and the Ghostbusters reboot, but we're going to focus on my two favorite, the original Ghostbusters from 1984 and then the sequel from 1989. I actually saw these out of order. I saw Ghostbusters 2 first. I had no idea what was going on or who they were, why they were back, and why that was important. When I did eventually see the original, it freaked me out completely. The hellhounds, all of it. It just like not the right movie to see when you're 7, but that was just me. So if you haven't seen Ghostbusters, that's okay. I'm going to give you the best plot summary of this movie, the most thorough, the most detailed, that will bring you right up to speed. It will be as if you've seen the movies while you're sitting here. So the setting is New York City in the 1980s. There's a photo of the famous Manhattan skyline there in Manhattan's heyday of the 1980s. And unfortunately, New York City is dealing with a ghost problem. They've got some ghosts, some ghouls, some goblins, some spook specters that have infiltrated the city boundaries, and people don't like these ghosts. They need busting. The folks to do that are the Busters of Ghosts, which are these 4 individuals here, these enterprising entrepreneurs of paranormal activity who provide that ghost busting service to the city. I hope you enjoyed that plot summary. That is just the most concise and thorough plot summary you will ever have of a movie. When I pitched this idea, and I've been wanting to do Ghostbusters for a long time as part of this series, we typically do a Halloween type or scary type IHL pop culture webinar every year, going back to 2022 when we started with Stranger Things. But I got some really skeptical looks. And the first thing that was asked was like, well, there's no war in Ghostbusters. The IHL is all about armed conflict. It's about warfare. Where is that present in Ghostbusters? And I looked at each of those individuals who I love very deeply as my family, and I said, I don't care what you think. I'm going to do Ghostbusters because I like Ghostbusters. And where there's a will, there's a way. You can find this legal analysis in just about anything if you look and stretch, look close enough and stretch far enough. So armed conflict is really critical. The question of whether armed conflict exists in Ghostbusters is really critical because it's the trigger point for IHL. IHL is a body of law, international humanitarian law, that's interchangeable with the law of war or law of armed conflict. They're synonymous phrases, terms. But in order for that body of law to apply, to be in effect, for the protections that IHL offers people like civilians to be active, there has to be an armed conflict. That makes complete sense. Determining whether there's an armed conflict is another question. And so sort of a baseline element of the Geneva Conventions is the application of IHL. And so we see here that IHL applies in declared wars. Well, that's sort of our classical definition of warfare. There's a card game with that name, I Declare War. That's how wars were sort of always started, right? One party, one state, one nation declared war on another. Well, a quick history lesson. The last time that there was an official declaration of war was actually in August of 1945, a little less than 24 hours before the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And that was when Russia declared war on Japan. In the intervening time, in that 80 or so years since, there has not been another declared war. And the drafters recognized that a declared war wasn't the only way that parties could fight each other. And so that's why they built a broader definition. And we see that reflected in Ghostbusters, because when we think about the two main bad guys of the original and the sequel, so Gozer on the top there and Vigo on the bottom, these are interdimensional spiritual beings. They're just looking to take over the earth, to reign supreme, to reincarnate themselves and rule over humanity. They're not interested in convening a legislature of ghosts and declaring war on humanity. They're going to attack. They're going to do what they have set out to do, and they're not going to wait for some prescriptive legislative act to do it. And the same holds true in our world. You don't see countries, you don't see armed groups wait and parse out a declaration of war in order to start up an armed conflict. So that's where the second element of this definition comes into play. And this was sort of really forward thinking for the drafters. This language was drafted in 1949, so just on the heels of World War II. The drafters couldn't have predicted what the next century plus would hold, but this part of the definition really enabled IHL to get its arms around the evolution of armed conflict, whether it was the proxy wars of the 1950s, 60s, and beyond, or some of the other non-international style armed conflicts that we saw. So this portion is really going to talk about two countries fighting each other. So any other armed conflict between countries. So something short of a declared war. And I want to get this out of the way. I talked about stretching things, right? So we're going to have to make some assumptions here, right? So the first portion of this is the business that it has to be between countries. And so we'll, for the sake of argument, say that the Ghostbusters represent the United States. I understand other countries could have Ghostbusters. These are our Ghostbusters. They represent humanity. We'll say that they represent a nation state in their capacity as ghost fighters. Gozer and Vigo, we'll call them leaders of the paranormal nation, call it Ghostlandia or something like that. I want you to be very appreciative of high-level PowerPoint skills to make what I believe to be the accurate ghost country flag, which you see down there at the bottom. I'll sign autographs later on printed out versions of this PowerPoint. So you've got your two sort of international bodies, your states, if it will. And so that gives us our setup here, right? Any other armed conflict between countries. But there remains that last portion. What's an armed conflict? It seems really obvious, like there should be an easy definition to define when does one exist. That's a really important question because that trips whether IHL applies in this sort of conflict. So we're going to get out our PKE meter and we're going to scan the Geneva Conventions, these great documents. There are more than one of them. There are 4 from 1949. And surely we can find with this advanced technology and their great drafting skills, a legal definition of when an armed conflict starts. Unfortunately, there's not a definition in there. This is the appropriate reaction there. This is the sort of reaction as a young law student that I had when I realized that the law doesn't always define everything that you need. That was baffling to me that the answers wouldn't have been crafted. But in many cases, that's difficult to do when you're trying to draft something that encompasses a wide variety of activity and needs to be drafted in a way that's applicable on into the future. But that Egon reaction is completely understandable. In this case, it's actually a 46-year wait until we get that sort of definition, and we get it from a UN tribunal, the ICTY, so a tribunal that was set up for the former Yugoslavia. And this case, the case in question is Tadic. The background of the case, the facts of the case really don't bear on our analysis here. But the court case there, the ICTY does give us a really useful definition. And understand, it might seem weird that 46 years pass before you get a workable definition here. That doesn't mean that people are sitting around and nobody knows what's going on, and so IHL just doesn't apply between 1949 and 1995 when this case comes down. But understand that IHL, just like every other body of law on the planet, criminal law, civil law, etc., is informed by a number of things. One of the big sort of informers of that, one of the shapers, is case law. Cases happen, facts develop that are unique to that case, but give situations that might be applicable to other situations. And it allows a court to interpret the law and provide clarity. Think about Miranda rights. So something that's given to you when you're arrested, you have the right to remain silent, et cetera, et cetera. Those didn't exist prior to that case. There wasn't clarity on what a police officer, a law enforcement officer had to advise a person when they were arrested. And so it took that case, it took Supreme Court action in that case to really define out what we now just assume is very common, your Miranda rights. That's woven its way into pop culture. IHL is no different, and the Tadic case gives us this definition on the bottom right here. It says armed conflict exists whenever there's a resort to armed force between the states. Great, we have moved the ball forward. That is awesome. Now we're cooking. Now we just need to know what is a resort to armed force. Clearly, the ICTY gave us that definition, right? They drilled down on that. No, we waited 46 years and the court couldn't bother to define that phrase that it created for purposes of defining this. Welcome to a world in which lawyers belong in ghost traps. That's our appropriate place. I say that lovingly as a lawyer. I will happily jump in one after this. If you were not mad at lawyers before this webinar, you probably are now, and you will be even more so by the end of this webinar. The exception to that is Louis Tully, and I understand he started out as an accountant, but he worked hard. He got his law degree at night, and even though he's a tax attorney with some probate on the side, he is accepted from this. This is the best of us embodied. So Louis, ignore that. What we get here is not a definition from the Tadic case in the ICTY, but we have the development of differing interpretations. Understandably, the court couldn't nail down every scenario in which there would be a resort to armed force. Trying to craft a legal analysis around that would be pretty difficult, all things considered. Much like the drafters of the Geneva Conventions, the deciders, the judges involved in this decision had to consider the future and application of the rule that they were creating. And so these different interpretations fall into 2 main buckets when it comes to what's a resort to armed force. We have the ICRC view, which is understandably, that's the International Committee of the Red Cross. That is a sister organization to the American Red Cross. We're part of the larger Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. We're independent, but we work together in pursuit of the same goals. The ICRC's central mandate is IHL, and they provide a lot of interpretive guidance, a lot of helpful analysis when it comes to breaking down and better understanding the provisions of IHL. Understand that the the ICRC doesn't make law. They're not out there crafting things that must be followed. Their analysis is prescriptive, but it's not a mandate. So the ICRC view is that a resort to armed force is a really low bar. There obviously, could be some threshold, but in general, just in practical terms, when the first bullet starts flying between the sides, that triggers IHL. That is a resort to armed force between states, and that triggers application of IHL. That viewpoint, that low bar to entry, makes complete sense from the ICRC's perspective. And it makes complete sense if you apply some common sense to this. The ICRC humanitarian organization, IHL is a humanitarian-focused body of law. The whole point is to reduce human suffering during armed conflict. And so it makes sense that you wouldn't want to stack a high hurdle to clear before IHL and its protections could be in play. So from the ICRC's perspective, once the fighting starts, it doesn't need to be protracted in the case of an international armed conflict. It doesn't need to meet a certain threshold of violence. It's enough that force is exchanged, and so IHL applies. That's the minority view in practicality. It's not that the ICRC is wrong. It's not a knock on their analysis, but the sort of majority view, or the what I call the historical or practical view, is a little bit different than that. Understand that there is no bright line, even amongst the majority, about what constitutes a resort to armed force. And that's because in history and practicality, it's nations that fight wars, right? The ICRC is not out there with an army. It's a neutral humanitarian organization. But when it comes to countries, they're obviously concerned about following the law, about abiding by it, about protecting those that deserve protections under IHL. But there's also a geopolitical dimension that the ICRC doesn't have to deal with when it crafts its analysis. That geopolitical consideration is one that's really understandable. If you had say a border guard decide to pop off a few rounds at the enemy because he's having a bad day, you wouldn't necessarily want to call that an armed conflict or call that a war. If that were the case, wars would be popping off all over the place with that very low threshold. And so understandably, different nations in different scenarios will look at the exchange of force very differently. Typically, without getting way into the fire swamp of it, we're in history, or in the state's perspective, you're looking for really an armed attack. So something a little beefier, a little more violent than a sort of smaller scale, sporadic exchange of force, even if violence is involved. So that's also understandable because you have this multidimensional consideration from nations as well. So those are our views, but applying them to Ghostbusters, does that mean that do we have a paranormal armed conflict here? Is that possible under either of these views? Well, let's take a look at each in turn.
Disgusting blob. I'm gonna have to hold it myself.
Poor Slimer. He did not deserve that treatment. As a kid, Slimer was my favorite, and I didn't understand why the Ghostbusters were trying to bust him. So this is from the original Ghostbusters. This is their first encounter, the first time they're using their proton packs. This is at the Hotel Sedgwick. They've called the Ghostbusters in to deal with Slimer. And you see there an exchange of force. Actually, before that, even they blow up a maid's cart in a pretty hilarious scene. Not for the maid though. But under the ICRC view, this would probably trip that threshold. It would be a resort to armed force. We'll have to consider that for these purposes, Slimer is a member of sort of the ghost armed forces, as it were, even though he's sitting there just trying to enjoy a meal. But that would be enough. So there you see Ray discharge his proton pack. It obviously has a violent effect. He's trying to capture the ghost, but in this scenario, I think you've got enough to trip IHL and constitute an armed conflict under the ICRC's view. Well, what about the historical or practical view? Let's look a little bit later in the movie.
It's the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
This is my all-time. I'm a big Star Wars fan. I love Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine, etc. But all due respect to the Star Wars universe, this is the best bad guy in all of film history. The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is amazing. At this stage of the movie, things look very different. This isn't a one-off at the Sedgwick Hotel. This is a full-on fight between Gozer, who has manifested herself or itself as a being. It is summoned the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man thanks to Ray. It would have helped to maybe imagine like a bobblehead or something like that. I don't know. A pile of dirt. I'm not sure. But this is a very different scale, a very different element. And so think about it from this United States perspective, since we're assuming that the Ghostbusters are representing the U.S. here. Earlier in the film, we're talking about a one-off. They're called into a hotel to deal with a single ghost. They cause a lot of destruction in the hotel. They rip that ballroom to pieces in that scene, but it's relatively contained. This isn't open conflict between the Ghostbusters and ghosts. This is just a single call. And you could understand if there was hesitation to call that instance, that limited instance, an armed conflict between the states. But fast forwarding to this scene at the end, now things have substantially escalated. Now you have sort of the takeover of a building by Gozer in downtown Manhattan. You have a gigantic marshmallow causing chaos through the streets. The Ghostbusters are out in the open fighting Gozer with their proton packs. This looks very different. And so I think this is a great example of how under the sort of prevailing viewpoint, this would be a resort to armed force between the parties. And so you get this nice juxtaposition, even within the original single Ghostbusters movie, of what those two viewpoints look like. So what's our result? Well, under either interpretation of resort to armed force, you do have an armed conflict. Now that it might be a question of when that armed conflict was kicked off. Was it sort of in the first act of the movie or the last? But either way, you can see both examples of where an armed conflict would exist and IHL would be triggered thanks to the Ghostbusters. All right, so I want to talk about my absolute favorite movie vehicle of all time. Second and third place would be the DeLorean from Back to the Future and the Ford Explorer and Jeep. I'll lump them together. The Wrangler from the original Jurassic Park. But the Ecto-1, you see it back here. I don't know why you wouldn't have an Ecto-1 in your office. Like, we're all adults. We can admit that we love this movie and this car. I had to put this in here. I've loved this vehicle since I was a kid. All due respect to Ghostbusters 2, we'll lump the Ecto-1A in there, even though it's technically a little bit different. But it got me thinking about this vehicle in particular, and in the context of this paranormal armed conflict. Is this a fair target? Is this something that the ghosts could go after, even though we don't see it as part of the actual fight? What do we know about that vehicle? Well, at its core, it's a '59 Cadillac. It's a Miller Meteor Futura. hope you came prepped to learn that tonight, and you could stick that in your back pocket for Halloween trivia. We also know that this vehicle is in need of a lot of help. According to Ray, he runs down the full list of all the sad components that need to be replaced in this car. Needs brakes, shocks, maybe some new rings, also mufflers and a little wiring. This thing needs some work. It's also been used at some point in its life as an ambulance. You see the siren up there on top as Ray pulls in, and Venkman tells him he can't park it there. You see the siren is still working. It's been a minute, clearly, since that thing was used as an ambulance, but that was its original use. So clearly a civilian vehicle. That's obvious from this. So when it comes to the question of whether it's a fair target, to really assess that from an IHL perspective, we have to go to the IHL fundamental principles and understand that the fundamental principles, these are like the foundation work of IHL. Underneath all of the Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, your other treaty law, your customary international law, sits these 4 fundamental principles that are applicable in any armed conflict. They help set the basics for IHL and the protections that it offers. And so 2 of them are really important in the context of looking at the Ecto-1. Military necessity, which to me is a gatekeeping principle. If you don't have military necessity, you don't pass go, you don't collect $200, and you can't use military force. And then distinction. And both of these principles at their core are concerned with using force against legitimate military objectives. In order to have the military necessity to use force to attack something, you have to be targeting a legitimate military objective. That's the essence of military necessity. For distinction, we want to target or attack legitimate military objectives, but not civilians or civilian objects. So there's that distinction line that's drawn between the 2. That's at the core. And when we go back and look at this Cadillac, this doesn't seem to be a legitimate military objective in any way. I mean, this is a broke down 59, and even at this point in the movie, this is like 25-year-old vehicle, rust bucket, in need of bad repairs. It's clearly civilian in nature, so it's not a legitimate military target, right? Well, to understand what a legitimate military objective is, this is what the law says. So when we talk about objects, these can vary in all sorts of ways, and objects that by their nature, so something like a tank or a fighter jet, is a military objective, a location like a military base, or a sort of forward observing position for artillery. But use is the one highlighted in yellow that I want to focus on here for purposes of the Ecto. Objects that by its use are going to make an effective contribution to military action. So what does that look like? Well, we know that the Ecto doesn't stay as that 59 Cadillac for long. They buff it up, they repair all of those things, and they turn it into this vehicle. It looks very different than its original incarnation. And this starts to look like it's being used differently. The Ghostbusters are using this as a means of conveyance. This is how they get from their fire station or their converted fire station to where ghosts are. This is how they transport their equipment, their proton packs, which they use to fight the ghosts. This is how they transport their ghost traps. This is how they communicate. They've got a communications array that allows them to communicate not just with their sort of home base, but theoretically they could tune into law enforcement frequencies, get reports about ghosts, make sure that they're going efficiently to the places that they need. Also, they have ghost detecting equipment aboard the Ecto-1. You weren't going to escape here without some like canon nerd facts about this vehicle. But you see that red device up top there, just to the left of the arrow. That's a gigantic PKE meter. So in the Ghostbusters world, a ghost detector. So they actually have the ability to, on the move, detect ghosts with this vehicle. So suddenly they are taking this broke down civilian ambulance, retired ambulance, and now they've changed its use. They are using it for a different purpose. They're using it for ghost busting purposes. And it's pretty clear that that vehicle is making an effective contribution. They wouldn't have invested all the money and the elbow grease that it took to revamp and revive this caddy if they didn't think that that would be the case. And certainly, whether it's the communications ability, the equipment transport, the ability to to transport the Ghostbusters from point A to point B, those are all things that are effective contributions to their military action. Understand that effective contribution doesn't have to be lethal in nature. It can be logistical in nature. It can be a measure of efficiency, so communications, intelligence gathering, etc. And the Ecto-1 checks off a lot of these boxes. It's a really effective mobile command center for the Ghostbusters. So this meets that definition nicely. So if its use makes it an effective contribution to the military action, we also have a second portion that's required in order to use military force. It's not enough that it's just a legitimate military objective. You also have to have this second part, and that's an intentional and there and not an or. So the second requirement is that the destruction of that object has to offer a concrete military advantage. Understandably, you could declare a lot of things an object that makes an effective contribution to military action. Say a power plant in Michigan theoretically provides power to the grid that powers a Northrop Grumman facility that is manufacturing drones that are eventually used in an armed conflict by the United States. There's a lot of links in that chain. And so that's where this second portion comes in, where you need this connection point. You need that contribution that's in the first portion. But destroying it has to offer not a speculative military advantage, but a concrete one. There's got to be that it narrows down the temporal nature between the object's contribution and the concrete military advantage that destroys it. So in the case of the Ecto-1, this absolutely offers a concrete military advantage if it's destroyed. I went through a lot of these technical capacities and the other capacities that the Ecto-1 offers to the Ghostbusters. You see an awesome cross-section here. You can actually go, this book is like an owner's manual for the Ecto-1 that you could just get if you ever, I guess, want to build your own and maintain it. I wouldn't recommend trying to mess around with a nuclear accelerator in building your own proton pack, but that's another story. But you see here the manifestation of what I'm talking about. This is a really effective military vehicle. I would equate this to, say, a Humvee or some other military transport in the context of a civilian vehicle that's been converted over. Think about maybe a Toyota Hilux, right? Like a pickup truck that we see in conflicts all over the globe. Those things are frequently used in an effective way and in a way that would be that would concretely contribute a military advantage if they were destroyed, whether they have a machine gun mounted on the back or they're ferrying fighters from point A to point B. The Ecto is no different. And the Ecto 1A is just a beefed up version of that with like an LED sort of jumbotron on the side of it. But I would say the Ecto 1A is even more effective. You've got an upgraded communication suite, an upgraded PKE detection array on the top there. Probably some upgrades on the inside that we don't have here. But understandably, in either case, destroying the Ecto-1 is going to advantage the Ghost. It's going to hobble the Ghostbusters' ability to get around, to detect the Ghost, to communicate, etc., etc. So unfortunately for the Ecto-1, as much as I love the vehicle, it is a legitimate military target. Had the Ghost been a little bit smarter, maybe they would have targeted that and destroyed it and hampered the Ghostbusters' ability just a little bit. So I'm going to end in a place that we obviously have to go, and that's talking about the two main bad guys, the arch villains of the original two movies. And if you're not familiar with them, you've got Gozer, aka Gozer the Gozerian, Gozer the Destructor, Gozer the Traveler. I won't pronounce that one. And then my favorite, thanks to Venkman, Flat Top. This is a sort of a demigod that in Ghostbusters lore has been worshipped throughout history. It's like a really destructive god that brings all sorts of death and malevolence to the earth. And Gozer is trying to reincarnate and take over Earth with its minions and sort of reign back over humanity once again. In Ghostbusters 2, you've got Vigo von Homburg, quite the name, aka the Scourge of Carpathia, the Sorrow of Moldavia, Vigo the Cruel, Vigo the Despised, Vigo the Unholy. What I'm experiencing right now is nickname envy. And I don't want horrible nicknames like this, but I'm realizing that a nickname is a nice thing to have. This is a nice status symbol. And I don't have any of these. I'm not the scourge of anything other than maybe not doing dishes or something like that that my wife would point out. I need to work on that. I just don't want a really horrible one like either of these fellows. So Vigo and Gozer share one thing in common, and that's the business of possessing people. Whether it's Dana Barrett being possessed by one of Gozer's minions, or poor Louis Tully being possessed by another of Gozer's minions. Side note, that minion is called Vince Clortho, and if Ghostbusters hadn't been made in 1984 before AI, I would tell you, I would be certain that the writers of that movie used ChatGPT to generate all the names in the movie. But Vince Clortho inhabits and possesses poor Louis Tully there, even changes him into like a demon dog or hellhound, whatever it is. And then you have Vigo there, ultra despicable, inhabiting poor Oscar Barrett here in Ghostbusters 2. This is Dana Barrett's baby. And the three of these individuals have one thing in common, other than being associated with the Ghostbusters, and that's that they're civilians. Understand that all three of these, in spite of their connection to the Ghostbusters, their affiliation with the Ghostbusters, these aren't combatants. These are civilians. I know you could make a quibble about Louis Tully at the end of Ghostbusters 2 when he suits up and grabs a proton pack. But for the majority, for the part of for the film where he gets possessed in Ghostbusters 1, he's still just the Ghostbusters accountant. And that alone, or Dana's association with the Ghostbusters, certainly Oscar's a baby. He can't have any sort of membership with them. That alone doesn't transform them into combatants or something that might change their status. These are civilians, pure and simple. And so when it comes to civilians and the protections that they're afforded in international armed conflicts, we've got a great resource for that. We have a Geneva Convention on civilian protections. That's GC4. And it was groundbreaking at the time. This was crafted and devised in recognition of the widespread horrors that civilians faced in World War II. The drafters, countries, parties to the Geneva Conventions recognized that this was a major gap in IHL and that civilians needed a special set of protections. So let's look at GC4 and see what it has to say about possessing people. And I told you you would hate lawyers even more once again, and here we are. I have to lodge an official complaint with the drafters of the Geneva Conventions, why they didn't have the foresight to include a provision about paranormal possession of people. Try saying that fast 10 times. Is beyond me. That's just completely short-sighted. It's a huge gap to this day. Maybe GC5 will have something about paranormal activity. I don't know. But we can't rely on GC4 for any sort of provision about the possession of civilians. But that doesn't mean that Dana, Louis, and Oscar are out of luck. Because undergirding the protection protections of civilians, things like protection against physical violence, so murder, injury, torture, that sort of thing, are a complementary set of protections to things like honor and dignity. So you can't really encapsulate honor and dignity. You can't put your hand on honor and dignity, but these are core fundamentals of what makes us people. A great example would be the practice of your religion of choice. Your religion is your free choice. Your ability to practice it is a core fundamental of free people. And denying that to someone or persecuting, discriminating them on them because of their religious practice, that really cuts against and really degrades that individual's honor and dignity. So that's a great example that's called out in the Geneva Conventions. But I would argue that when it comes to the business of possessing another individual, this is a classic example of something that just flies in the face of one's honor and dignity. In the case of Lewis and Dana, they're possessed and they lose all control over themselves. They lose control of their bodies. They're not controlling what they're doing or where they're going. They lose control of their minds. They're saying things that they wouldn't normally say. They're doing things, making decisions that they wouldn't normally make. Take Dana, for example, that great scene where Venkman comes over thinking it's going to be a normal interaction, and she throws open the door looking like this and talking like crazy. This is a fundamental degradation of these three, their honor and dignity, certainly of the babies who had no choice in the matter, and suddenly he's like the vessel for this like ancient pure evil man to come back to life in the 20th century. But this is a great example of how the Geneva Conventions protect more than just your physical safety. It goes beyond that. And I would argue that I should sort of retract my complaint against the drafters, because in a way, this really gets at the same concerns that I would have that you might need a specific provision for something like paranormal possession, as ridiculous as that is. This is a wide net, and it encompasses a lot when it comes to the business of being a free civilian, even one who is jeopardized by armed conflict. So the result, unfortunately, is that this is a pretty major breach of IHL. The business of denying or degrading or harming a civilian's honor or their dignity is a pretty serious violation of IHL. The Geneva Conventions doesn't distinguish that from physical harm. They're all protected. They're all sort of encompassed in this same bubble. Unfortunately, when I delivered this news to Gozer a little bit ago, she asked me if I was a god, and I understand that when you're asked if you're a god, you're supposed to say yes. I did watch Ghostbusters. I learned from Ray's example. I said no, and she shocked me nearly to death. So I'm lucky to be here giving this webinar as a result. So I want to thank you for bearing with me. This is the kind of fun that we have. Again, we may have different definitions of fun, but I hope this allowed you to sort of unpack Ghostbusters in a different light. Maybe you go back and watch it as Halloween is upon us and enjoy it. You see different issues and things that maybe you didn't spot before. Maybe you understand or appreciate IHL a little bit differently thanks to the Ghostbusters. But most importantly, I want to thank you for taking time on your Wednesday evening or Wednesday day, work day, school day, to come out and listen to me blabber about Ghostbusters. I do have a special programming announcement. The World of the Psychic, so Dr. Venkman's great program, has been bumped from its normal noon time slot. That's actually going to be shown tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So you won't miss Dr. Venkman and his wonderful interviews of psychics and their powers. So thanks so much for coming. If you want more of this, if you want to learn more, if you want more of our pop culture content or just IHL content, generally, use that QR code on the left. You can scan it with your phone or your mobile device. That will take you to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe. You can click the little bell icon so that you're notified when we put up recordings or other events. You can visit us there at the URL at the bottom. You can just go to YouTube and enter at American Red Cross IHL. That'll take you right to our page. It's a full repository of everything from academic lectures to expert guest speakers to our pop culture library. If you're interested in staying up on the events that we have going each month, we send out a monthly events email that you can sign up for using that QR code on the left. You just need your name and your email address. We promise not to spam you. It literally is just a newsletter about national headquarters webinars. We don't pack any other content in there. The registration links are always provided. Event descriptions are provided. So it's a really handy monthly tool. And we send reminder emails out so that if something falls off your radar, we give you a little tap on the shoulder. But on behalf of the International Humanitarian Law Program with the American Red Cross, I want to thank you. You can always reach out to me, thomas.harper@redcross.org, if you have questions or want to engage further. I'm always happy to talk Ghostbusters or Star Wars or anything else. Thanks, and we hope to see you next time.